This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Hello. Thank you for sharing the next few moments with me. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese, in a sneak attack, bombed Pearl Harbor, killing some 2,000 American military men. Later on, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would describe December 7th, 1941 as a day of infamy. Books were written about it. Movies were made about it. On September the 11th, 2001, radical Islamists destroyed the Twin Towers trade centers in New York City, killing some 3,000 individuals, American citizens, mostly civilians. Who were these people? Why would they want to kill that many people? Why would they want to destroy such landmarks as the Twin Towers? Let's look at that for the next few moments that we have together. Ever since that day, we have known of that event as 9/11. The phrase is common throughout the world. Many different peoples use it to refer to that date. And certainly it was a day of infamy, if there ever was one. But where did Islam come from? Now, I said these people were Islamic terrorists. Where did Islam come from? Islam is in the news almost daily. We're familiar with the expression suicide bombers, and we read news stories on a daily basis almost of even babies being used with bombs strapped to them to destroy individuals, civilians. We call them terrorists because their design behind such activities are to strike terror into the hearts of individuals around the world. If you look today at the religious situation around the world, you find out that Christianity is the major religion, consisting of some 2 billion adherents, or 33% approximately of the world's population. Islam is the second largest religion in the world, consisting of 1.5 billion people, or almost 22% of the world's population. Hindu would have about 1 billion of the world's adherents at 15%, and Buddhism at 6%, with about 14% of the world's population professing no religion at all. It is also noted on a daily basis that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world today. I would really put a question mark after the word religion, because the force behind Islam is not simply religious. It is an ideology that covers individuals who are its adherents from the birth to the grave. All aspects of lives of people who live in Islamic countries are controlled by Sharia, which is Islamic law. It dictates what they do in religion, what they do in their private life, what they do in regard to education, in regard to the courts, every aspect. And the world vision of Islam is that they should control the world with Sharia law. Now, the cradle of Islam we describe as the Arabian Peninsula. That area of the world that is referred to as Arab. And we want to look at this part of the world before the beginning of Islam. Geographically, it's a very, very demanding part of the land area of the world. It is primarily desert. It's a country that is, or a part of the world that is bordered on the north by Iraq, on the northeast by Iran and the Persian Gulf, on the west by the Red Sea, and on the south by the country of Yemen in our day and time. We're familiar with this area of the country in the past 10 years or so, especially because of the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. This is the cradle of Islam. And its most important issue of the people who lived there before the time of Islam was survival. Now, the beginning of Islam is usually dated somewhere around 610 AD. Muhammad, who was the originator of Islam, was born in 570 AD. It was 610 when he began to preach, and that's considered to be the beginning of Islam. The culture prior to that time consisted of Arabs, and their origin is largely unknown, except perhaps for migration from what we know as the Holy Land or the land of Palestine. We have biblical history, of course, of the Jews, actually prior to the Jews, going all the way back to the days of creation. We know the book of Genesis gives us a record of the beginning of the Jewish nation, which Jehovah God described as his chosen people, to bring us into the time when the Messiah would come through that race of people. The law of Moses was the rule of law as far as Jews were concerned, and as far as the religion of Judaism was concerned. An interesting aspect of the law of Moses was that in Old Testament times, the law of Moses was the rule not only for Israel as far as religion was concerned, but it was also the rule of law as far as the secular part of their existence was concerned. We know that there came a point in the history of Israel when they demanded to have a king, and Samuel objected to that. He became very upset, and Jehovah God told Samuel, "Let them have the king. They haven't rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me." So at that point, they began to have a secular portion and a religious portion, but still the law of Moses ruled. That's a bit of the history of Judaism, which later, of course, would give birth to Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who would establish Christianity and which would be spread all over the world as well. The people of the Arab Peninsula before the time of Islam, it was a tribal type of existence. There were no nations per se. There were just tribes. And during that period of time, which was some 600 years after the time of Christ, warfare was the dominant element of that culture. An eye for an eye was the dominant philosophy. War was the standard way to gain wealth, standard way to gain other people. Violence through war existed with the kidnapping of women and children. Many times when these wars would take place, the battles would take place, then the men would be killed, and the women and the children would be taken back to be used as concubines or slaves by the conquering tribe. This was the kind of social order that existed in this part of the world where Islam was born prior to the time of Islam. Now, as far as religion prior to the time of Islam, it consisted mainly of what we might refer to as paganism. There were a lot of different pagan religions, a lot of different religious idols. In paganism, we usually associate with some kind of idol or physical creation, or God as they would refer to it. Sabaeanism was also a religion that influenced the development of Islam after its establishment. Sabaeanism worshipped heavenly bodies, such as the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun. It may be that Islam took the worship of Sabaeanism as they used for their symbol the crescent and the star. This may be the influence of Sabaeanism. Undoubtedly, the religions that existed, the pagan religions prior to the time of Islam, were a great influence on Muhammad as he began the Islamic religion and continues to be so even in our day and time. In fact, some authorities in our day and time, some scholars, have made the statement that Islam in our day and time is an effort to establish a 7th century culture on the entire world, and so require of the entire world to live according to that culture, because that's the culture that Islamic nations in our day and time even live by. They have adopted many of the practices of those times, which include beheading, severe punishment for the slightest deviation from Islamic law, and that kind of thing. A lot of Jews had migrated to the Arabian Peninsula over the years, and the oral traditions that would come as a result of Judaism itself, because back in those days there was not a lot of written material. As these caravans made their way from one part of the world to another, or one part of that part of the world to another, stories would be told orally from one caravan to the other. And as people met, the religion that they practiced would have an effect on others. And so Judaism, having quite a few adherents, Jews, settled on the Arabian Peninsula, had a tremendous effect on Islam, as was the case with Christianity. If you've ever read the New Testament, you know that in the book of Acts, in the beginning of chapter 8, the story of the persecution brought about by Saul of Tarsus resulted in the expulsion of Christians, or migration of Christians, from the city of Jerusalem. The church was spread abroad, with the exception of the apostles at that time, the text points out. The statement is also made there in the beginning of Acts chapter 8, that everywhere the Christians went that were spread abroad, they began to preach. They preached Jesus Christ. Many of these Christians migrated to the east, onto the Arabian Peninsula. And so there were stories, oral traditions that went along with the Christians as well. Some who have investigated and studied quite a bit in that area can tell many accounts of the oral traditions that were told by Christians of that day and by Jews of that day who lived on the Arabian Peninsula, and no doubt throughout the rest of the world as well. Gnosticism, a philosophy of that day and time, which was basically a philosophy without a God, taught knowledge almost to be God. Christianity faced a lot of this philosophy because Jesus Christ came to the earth as the Son of God. John chapter 3 and verse 16 tells us that God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have life everlasting. Now, the teaching of the philosophy of Gnosticism could not even come close to accepting the fact that God would inhabit a human form, because they thought that flesh and blood was sinful, and that God was so far distant away from that, He couldn't even come close. And that only through a series of emanations from God, continually, on and on and on and on, could God ever communicate with man. They believed Jesus Christ to be that final figure that could communicate with man, as it were. This was the kind of influences that Gnosticism had, or that Islam had. Now, the birth of Muhammad was actually the beginning of Islam. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in 570 AD in the city of Mecca on the Arabian Peninsula, of the tribe of Quraysh. His family was very prominent in that tribe, and that tribe was one of the outstanding and most prominent tribes on the Arabian Peninsula. The reason being that they were guardians of the Kaaba, which is the holy shrine of Islam. And back in those days, it was the holy shrine of all pagan religions. There would even be pilgrimage made by religions from around the world at different times to the Kaaba in order that they might worship at the shrine of their idol, whatever their religion might have been. The Kaaba itself, of course, was the religious shrine of pagan religions prior to the time of Muhammad, and it continues to be the main primary shrine of Islam itself in our day and time. One of the outstanding features of the Islamic religion, one of the requirements of the Quran is that each person who is a Muslim, sometime during their lifetime, will make a pilgrimage to the country of Saudi Arabia, as it's known today, and to Mecca and to the Kaaba, and worship there, which is a very difficult thing to do for people who are poor and who live in regions throughout the entire world. Muhammad was born in 570 AD. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was only 6 years old. His next caretaker was his grandfather, who lived until Muhammad was 8 years old before he died. Following that point in time, the greatest influence of Muhammad was his uncle Abu Talib, and he was with him unto adulthood. His closest friend, that is of Muhammad, was Abu Bakr. Actually, later on, Muhammad would marry the daughter of Abu Bakr when the daughter was only 6 years of age, consummate the marriage when she was 9 years of age. Abu Bakr was also a very great influence upon Muhammad as he developed the religion of Islam. This period in time was a time of caravans. Muhammad became a trader. He traveled with the caravans. He traded. He was very successful. According to historians, Muhammad was quite a businessman. And eventually, he would meet Khadijah, a woman 15 years his senior. Khadijah was also a very successful person as far as caravans were concerned, the trade caravans of that day. She had accumulated quite a bit of wealth. Eventually, they became married. He and Khadijah made a great team. They became even more successful as far as business was concerned. This afforded Muhammad the opportunity to do one of his favorite pastimes, we might say, and that was to begin to meditate. He liked to get away from the crowds, and he would go to a cave not far outside the city of Mecca, and he would meditate. Frequently he would be found there, sometimes for days at a time. Now, there is a passage in the New Testament recorded in John chapter 16, verse 13. Jesus is in a conversation with his apostles. And he says to his apostles, however, and I'm quoting that verse, when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak of himself. He will speak, but not by his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will tell you things to come. Again, that is a statement made by Jesus Christ to his apostles in a conversation with them upon his telling them that he was going to be crucified, he would be resurrected from the tomb, and he would ascend back into heaven. And he told them that it was required that he should go away. It was prophesied that he would be crucified and that he would be resurrected and he would ascend back into heaven. All of that was a part of Jewish philosophy. The apostles should have understood that. And so he was preparing them for this departure that he would make. We understand, and historians down through the centuries have understood John 16:13 to be referring to the Holy Spirit, the third person in the Godhead. We know that the God of the Bible is made up of three personalities, of three different essences, of one in teaching. And in so many ways, one. But there is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's pointed out even in the very beginning at the creation. Whenever the plural nouns, pronouns are used in describing God in His creation of man. In the book of Genesis, in the first chapter, long about verse 26, the statement is made, let us make man in our image. And so He made man. He made them male and female. He made them in His own image. He breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and they became a living soul. So the God ahead of the Bible is made up of three personalities: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. John chapter 16, when Christ was talking about the Holy Spirit, that's the third person in the Godhead that He was referring to. So at this point, Muhammad had begun to receive revelations, he believed, he claimed, from the angel Gabriel, who were given the revelations by Allah, the God of Islam. And Muhammad would then recite these revelations to his friends. They would write these revelations down on a piece of stick or a piece of bark or a palm leaf or whatever they could find. Muhammad did this for 23 years. In fact, the last 23 years of his life, he spent reciting these visions. Now, the central message that Muhammad received was monotheism, the worship of one God. Monotheism belief in and of itself does not identify any particular God, but it simply refers to any religion that recognizes only one God. Muhammad began to preach that. This was quite different of the pagan religions in existence in that day and time, because each one of them recognized their own God. In fact, in the Kaaba, there had been built idols of each one of the various religions in the Arabian Peninsula, in that part of the world. There was a shrine to each one of them, or an image to each one of them in the Kaaba itself. And then in the pilgrimage that I mentioned a little while ago, these people would come to worship at their particular shrine, whatever their religion, their paganism was. After 3 years of preaching primarily monotheism, and that there is one God and His name is Allah, after 3 years then, Muhammad had lured only 40 people approximately to his beliefs. Those were primarily members of family. Along about this time, Khadijah died at age 65. He had been preaching for some 13 years. And Khadijah, his wife, died at age 65. And Muhammad fell into a state of depression. One day he was asleep at the Kaaba, the shrine of all of the idols, and there appeared to him the angel Gabriel, according to Muhammad's claims, who took him, Muhammad, to a white horse. And on the white horse he was taken to Jerusalem, city of Palestine, of course, the headquarters of Judaism, and later on of Christianity, where it began. There in Jerusalem, Muhammad met Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, according to his claims. Now, he went on through 7 different heavens on this horse. That was his claim. And he received instructions regarding prayer during this event. Now, he went all the way to heaven, and he met a lot of the people of the Old Testament. For example, Adam in the beginning, and Moses, and Abraham. Of course, we know that the religion of Islam claims Abraham as their ancestor. That's why they will try to point out that the 3 major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were all descended from the same individual. But they claim descendancy down through Ishmael rather than Isaac. Isaac being God's chosen son, according to the Old Testament, and Isaac being the individual, the son, through whom the tribe of Israel came, and which nation through which Jesus Christ, the Messiah, came. So the 2 religions part company in that particular respect. But after he had gone through these 7 heavens to heaven itself, he came back and he met Moses again. He had been given instructions supposedly in heaven that he should pray 50 times a day. Well, when he came back and he told Moses about it, then Moses told him that was too many to go back and find out further instructions. So he went back to heaven again, and that was reduced to 45 prayers in any given day, in every given day. And so he returned again, and Moses sent him back a 3rd time. And then it was reduced to 40, and so on until all the way down to 5. Final was 5. 5 prayers should be offered by every Muslim every day, all facing at that particular point in time Jerusalem. This sounds strangely like an event that is described in the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis, when God had determined that He was going to destroy the city of Sodom because of its sins. Abraham intervened on Sodom's behalf and asked God if He would destroy it if Abraham could find religious or righteous people, at least 50 there. God said He would not destroy it if there could be 50 righteous people found. Well, 50 could not be found, so Abraham made a further request of 40. And he continued to make these requests, and they continued to fail to find righteous people in that number, whatever was being requested, all the way down to 10. This sounds strangely similar to what Muhammad claimed in regard to the number of prayers. However, even in our day and time, 5 prayers a day is required of Muslims throughout the world. And now they have to kneel and bow to Mecca. That was changed from Jerusalem early on in the religion of Islam. So we still have that practice in the religion of Islam in our day and time. Now this event, that is this trip to heaven that he supposedly made, led eventually to the construction of the Dome of the Rock on the Jewish temple site. By that we're talking about the hill in Jerusalem where the original temple that was built after the Jews were brought into the Promised Land, as described in the Old Testament. After they were settled there, the tabernacle worship was done away. That was a mobile form of temple, and it was ceased to be used. The temple was built, and Solomon built the temple, and it was destroyed a couple of times in history, and then it was rebuilt. The last time it was rebuilt there was rebuilt by Herod in biblical times. Later on, Islam would conquer Judaism in that particular part of the world, and they would build eventually the greatest mosque among their religion on the site of the old Jewish temple, which is now referred to as the Dome of the Rock Mosque, and is one of the most holy places as far as Islam is concerned. Now, eventually, near the end of his first 13 years of preaching, he had made many converts in Mecca. Muhammad began to receive opposition. This opposition resulted in his fleeing to Medina, a city not too far on the Arabian Peninsula from where Mecca was. Now, his preaching also changed when he moved from Mecca to Medina. In Mecca, his preaching primarily was that of monotheism, with Allah as the one true and living God. Very severe penalties could be brought to bear on people who would not convert to Islam at that time. This came to be more so after he moved to Medina. In Medina, he began to get opposition from the Jews that were citizens there, that were inhabitants of Medina. Also, the Arabs who were there began to oppose him. He began to raid caravans in order to gather wealth for the furtherance of this religion of Islam that he had begun. By the way, the word Islam means submission. Originally, the word was used and defined as peace. Eventually, it became to be submission. It's the religion of submission to God. And a Muslim describes an individual who is an adherent to Islam, and they are one who has submitted. Muhammad began raiding caravans, gathering wealth. The Meccans tried to exact revenge on Muhammad even after he had moved to Medina. And there were wars at different times between Muhammad from Medina and the Meccans. Eventually, Muhammad won that war. He returned victoriously to Mecca. By military strength, Islam then had become the dominant religion in Arabia. All of the Arabian Peninsula was under the authority of Islam religion and Muhammad as the individual that was most powerful. He was the victor. He had gained this almost entirely by military strength. Muhammad wasn't very successful in his preaching. That's why he turned to the military aspect, the force aspect of requiring people to become members of Islam. In fact, even from the beginning, he slowly got the idea, began to practice force in his gathering adherents to religion. Now, he went back to Mecca. Victory had been his. He entered the Kaaba, and he destroyed all the idols that were there all of the pagan idols except the one to Allah. Some have estimated there were at least 360 pagan idols in the Kaaba at that time. Allah was the only one that he kept. And that's where the name Allah for the God of Islam came from. Actually, the name Allah had been used down through the centuries prior to the time of Muhammad. It was not original to him. The word Allah was generally understood to mean the chief God or the ruling God, the one God, even among the pagans prior to that time. So Muhammad destroyed the idols. He kept the name Muhammad and kept preaching monotheism. He demanded it of all people. Now, during the final 10 years of his life, in keeping with what he had been doing since he had moved back to Medina, Muhammad led 27 military campaigns personally. And he was responsible for, some say, hundreds more that Muhammad himself had planned. He sent out his lieutenants in these military campaigns. Not all of them every single time were victories, but overall they were victorious. On his last pilgrimage, Hajjara is what he called it, to Mecca, was the time of his death, 632 years after the time of Christ. He died at age 65. And the Quran, which is the culmination of all of the supposed visions that Muhammad had through Gabriel, became the ultimate authority for Muslims. Now, as far as the Quran is concerned, it simply means the recitation or the reading. Claims are made by the Quran itself that it came directly from Allah, revealed to the angel Gabriel, who then revealed it to Muhammad. The Quran itself consists of one book, divided into 114 surahs or chapters, a chapter being similar to that of our New Testament or Old Testament in our copies of the Bible. Now, these surahs in the Quran are not in any chronological order. If you compare that to the Bible, you know that in the beginning of the Scriptures, Genesis chapter 1, the account of the creation is given. And then all the way down to the last chapter of the book of Revelation, which marks the end of God's inspiration, marks the end of God's revelation to man, claims to be, the New Testament does, God's final revelation to man, which means there would be no further prophets inspired of God, as were biblical prophets and teachers in New Testament times, are more or less all of those in chronological order. The surahs are not in any chronological order. Now, the spread of Islam from the beginning needs to be considered. Islam is a supremacist type of ideology, meaning that they believe Islam to be the only religion, the only true religion in nowadays, and that Islam should actually rule all the peoples of all of the earth. That there should be no secular part of humanity, but that it should all be under the control of Islam itself. That's why it's often described as an ideology rather than a religion. Now, by 732 AD, Muslim armies had conquered all of the Middle East and North Africa, and even into Spain and Turkey, India, and parts of China. Islam, that is Muslims and their armies, would expand even into the continent of Europe. They were eventually stopped in the year 732 in the Battle of Tours. Then for a couple of hundred years, Islam was sort of in decline. Then at the beginning of or latter part of the 19th century, and the 20th century itself, especially the last half of the 20th century, and on into the 21st century, Islam has continued to grow. One of the reasons for that is prior to the discovery of oil in the internal combustion engine, There was no money in the Arabian Peninsula. There was nothing there much except the trade caravans. But as a result of literally trillions of dollars that have poured into the nations that are Islamic nations that inhabit that part of the world in our day and time, there has been great expansion throughout the world. Islam has been able to realize what Muhammad was teaching back in his day, and that is that the whole world should be Islam. And so using this oil money, as we might call it, they have been able to accomplish so much. For example, here in the United States, there have literally been hundreds of mosques that have been built by Saudi Arabia and by princes from Saudi Arabia. Islamic schools here in the United States. There are estimates now that as many as 2,300 to 2,600 mosques exist in the United States, along with several hundred Islamic schools, many of them full-time. The important thing to remember about the expansion or the spread of Islam is that it was spread primarily by violence, beginning with the wars of the caravans, the trade caravans in the beginning, all the way down through the centuries when Islam would conquer countries. And when those countries were conquered, they would require the inhabitants of those countries, the citizens, actually they would give them three choices. One choice was they could be executed. The second was if they didn't convert to Islam, they would be taxed very heavily. And the third one was they could be humiliated. Currently, there are around 56 countries in the world that are predominantly Muslim. That is, they are more or less controlled by Sharia, which is the law of Islam. Changing demographics in the last 2 or 3 decades have shown tremendous increases in the Muslim population, especially of Europe and even here in the United States. In Europe, there have been places, some cities, some even large cities, that the Muslim population has become so great that even though that nation might be primarily a democratic nation, yet Muslims have been enabled to at the ballot box, gain control of certain locations. And the same seems to be continuing from time to time and from day to day. Even here in the United States, back in the middle of the 20th century, there were only a few thousand Muslims in this country. Now there are estimates of as many as 8 or 9 million, or as little as 2 million, somewhere in between, depending on the source that you use. This has happened, and especially in the last 2 or 3 decades. All kinds of tactics have been used in order to accomplish these increases in Muslim populations throughout the world. Now we raise the question, is there a religious vacuum in the religious world? Well, we might again remind ourselves of the fact that in Europe, the continent of Europe, in the last half century or more, the attendance figures in church buildings of Europe has greatly decreased. A very small percentage of people in those countries visit the services publicly anymore. Christianity has decreased because of that. Some have suggested that there is a religious vacuum, therefore, on the continent of Europe. Some extreme radicals in Islam have bragged that the first Islamic country on the continent of Europe will be Great Britain, which is a frightening thing, even though it be a radical leader in Islam that predicts that or prophesies that. The world view of Islam is, as I mentioned back earlier, rule of the entire world. They believe that the whole world must be Islam. They're willing to accomplish that through the tactics of what is referred to as jihad. Now, jihad is defined as an internal struggle, and the apologists for Islam will define it that way. They will tell you that jihad does not refer to military force or violence or terrorism, that it refers only to the inward struggle of each individual of living the right kind of life, the kind of life that Allah would have them to live. The fact of the matter is, if you read the works of those who have been born and reared and spent many years in Islamic controlled countries, you know that to them, to any person, especially in those countries, who is Muslim, that jihad is remembered primarily as being the tactic of military or violent force on the inhabitants of the world to become converts, as it were, or reverts, as they would describe them, to Islam. These are a few facts about where Islam came from. As we consider what happened at New York in the destruction of the Twin Towers back in the year 2001, on the 11th day of September, referred to so many times, literally thousands of times since that time, as 9/11. This is a little bit about those people who brought about that destruction of 3,000 souls in those Twin Towers on that day. A little bit about their religious philosophy, a little bit about what they believe. And one thought that we might add here in closing is that the belief among Muslims is, and taught in the Quran, their ultimate authority is that an individual who is a martyr for Allah, who dies on the field of battle for Allah, whether it be a suicide bombing, whether it be on the battlefield, whether it be a bomb attack, however it is, anyone who dies violently, especially among the males, will go to paradise. The paradise that has been prepared by Allah. That's a bit about those people that destroyed the Twin Towers. Thank you for your attention.